Welcome, everyone, to this special virtual edition of Campfire Chats, an annual event presented by UCalgary to honor National Indigenous Peoples Day, which takes place on June 21st. I'm Deborah Yedlin, your moderator for today and the Chancellor of UCalgary, and I'm thrilled to be here with Dr. Reg Crowshoe, UCalgary's Elder in Residence, and our panelists, Alberta Regional Chief Marlene Poitras, Dr. Lindsay Crowshoe with the Cummings School of Medicine, and Ryan Robb, CEO of the Stoney Tribal Administration. I would like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Blackfoot Confederacy, comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3, and the University of Calgary is situated on land adjacent to where the Bow River meets the Elbow River, and that the traditional Blackfoot name of this place is Mohkinstsis, which we now call the City of Calgary. I am humbled and grateful to live, work, and learn on this land that we call home. I would like to welcome Dr. Reg Crowshoe, UCalgary's Elder in Residence, to lead us in an opening prayer and smudge. Reg is a member and former chief of the Piikani First Nation in southern Alberta. He is a well-respected and well-known community leader, ceremonial elder, and spiritual advisor. Reg has a long-standing relationship with the University of Calgary and has generously shared and offered his assistance, ceremonial leadership, and traditional knowledge to students, staff, faculty, and senior leadership for many years. Reg received an honorary doctorate from the university in 2002 and is also a member of the University Senate. Thank you for leading us, Reg. Over to you.
Okay. I just want to welcome everybody. Okay, dami Christikon Christikuik. Artakamato Simdaxit Spumwayam Stikshi Ayakshi. I just like to welcome everybody today to this webinar, and we had a meeting a while ago with elders, and they were trying to make the best out of the situations we live in today. And one of the things the elders talked about was a concept of putting spirit back into the technology or Zoom that we're using today. So with that, with that spirit, I just wanted to light up my smudge and do an opening prayer. And in our way, that's a formal call to order, but also protect everybody, the listeners, the speakers, to protect us, so to have Creator protect us. So I'll light up my smudge. It's we say Creator gave us all our gifts, ceremony, our way of Creator gave us smudge, and with those gifts, we accommodate our ways of life. So oh, Kistipatapio, ayo napi natus. Oh, Kispumo Kinana Christikoi. Ayo do Pachimo Scap Sitokianik ni Tamakamutan. Ayo Spumo Kinana Sitokyo. I'm Stikia Creepy, Janika Maxikinata Papers, Piaotayakanspia. I used to pat a Piapanakai is Chiwaka. Matapachimos, go Kistipata Piapanakanata Pito, Pachimos can Christikoi. The Spumos also to sin I am straight. Christistoxin. Oh, Kistipata Pio Nate to Yaka, Krakum not to eat a bio and Hoximiskasa. Oh, Gigakoxiscatopia, and a Kumakitapio Kamutani, and a Casitapio Christicatus ni Patapioxin. Oh, Knit to eat Pachimoska Christikoi. I think ni Tamaka Mutan, Axipatapioxin, Misami Patapioxin, Anyai. Thank you very much.
Thank you for bringing spirit into our virtual world. It'd be nice if we could have smelled the smoke that was burning, but I guess we'll have to wait till we're in person for that. It's Hope, UCalgary's Indigenous strategy has been guiding our institution to indigenize teaching, learning, and research since 2017, and has been guided by leadership from our Provost and Vice President Academic Drew Marshall, Michael Hart, Vice Provost Indigenous Engagement, Shauna Cunningham, Director of the Indigenous Strategy, and Dr. Reg Crowshoe. This event is just one of many that are presented throughout the year to unpack the complexities of colonialism and indigenization, and to shed a spotlight on Indigenous thinkers and leaders. Especially now, during this time of uncertainty, it is vital to hear Indigenous and ally voices and to make space for Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, connecting, and being across our campus and beyond. Thank you to everyone out there for joining us virtually. Open, interactive dialogue is what Campfire Chats is all about. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and note if your question is for a specific speaker. We'll get to as many of your questions as we can. Our first panelist is Marlene Poitras, Alberta Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. She was elected to this role in 2018 by treaty numbers 6 and 7, and she's the first woman in history to hold the position of Alberta Regional Chief for the Assembly of First Nations. Regional Chief Poitras oversees several national portfolios at the AFN and is passionate about addressing climate change, homelessness, and advancing youth and women leadership. She currently sits on the Alberta First Nations Women's Council on Economic Security. Thank you for joining us, Regional Chief Poitras. And let me jump into my first question. As Regional Chief, can you describe some of the complexities of working with provincial and national governments during the pandemic and how you foresee this relationship evolving as we look to the future?
Thank you, Deborah. First of all, Takamskat na kakyo, negan notawinaw nanaskamaw anuskisigaw samana megoya. I just want to acknowledge the panelists, Ryan Robb and Dr. Lindsay Crowshoe, and thank our elder, Dr. Reg Crowshoe, for starting us off in a beautiful prayer this afternoon. And I just also want to thank the University of Calgary for the invitation to join you today. So to respond to the question, a main challenge, especially initially, was around jurisdiction. Health is a provincial responsibility, but First Nations generally only deal with the federal government in their day-to-day operations. There's a historical tendency on the part of the provinces to absolve their responsibility to First Nations and say, we don't deal with you because the federal government does. One of the reasons so many First Nations in Alberta declared their own states of emergency was to remind the Crown of their treaty obligations to First Nations during times of crisis. First Nations in Alberta are beneficiaries to clauses in their treaties for the provision of medicine and for assistance in time of pestilence. This pandemic is a specific circumstance where the Crown, through our treaties, promised to support us in the way that we needed. First Nations reminded governments that supporting our communities was not another box to check off, but a legal requirement that's been in place since the treaty was entered into. Our leaders made themselves clear. We need to be at the table. Our communities need adequate resources to support a response that accounts for our unique needs and vulnerabilities. One of the things I often said in the first months of this pandemic was that it is in everyone's best interest to ensure all communities are prepared to deal with this pandemic, including First Nations. The strong leadership our community showed early on made an impact. Governments began recognizing the need to respond to First Nations in a timely manner because they faced a different reality than the rest of the country, which makes them more vulnerable. There was and continues to be a willingness to make resources and information readily available to First Nations. Here in Alberta, our Indigenous Services Canada regional office did a fantastic job of quickly establishing lines of communication, folding in Alberta Health Services into discussions with our leaders, and assembling frontline teams to work directly with communities in developing pandemic plans, identifying needs, and helping secure resources to address those needs. Fast forward to today, and First Nations are being recognized for how they address this crisis. By setting up borders, curfews, and other security measures, we have statistically fared far better than Canadians. For example, yesterday there were a total of 64 identified cases on reserve for a First Nation population of around 100,000 to 150,000 approximately in Alberta. Compare that to the 7,500 plus total confirmed cases in Alberta for a population of 4.3 million. This is a true testament of the resiliency and sense of community of our people. When difficult times come our way, we do our best to make the most of what we have to protect our people and our most vulnerable. That said, let's not forget that the First Nation response so many are celebrating did not just come out from an overabundance of caution, it was born out of necessity. Our leaders put these extraordinary measures in place because many First Nations still lack access to quality healthcare, adequate housing, safe drinking water. Our people have a disproportionate amount of pre-existing conditions or autoimmune issues. We have elders who could perish from this disease. And unfortunately, we did have one elder that perished in Kainai. And my deepest condolences to the community on their loss. Whenever we lose our elders, we also lose a part of our history. So when I think of how we move forward with our relationship with both the federal and provincial crown, I think we need to take a serious look at how we can build something better than what we did before. So that when the next crisis hits, our communities aren't forced to completely shut down because we lack the proper infrastructure or we lack the proper healthcare. I've been saying this a lot lately, and I'll share this with you all here again. I keep hearing that people can't wait until things get back to normal. There's a part of me that says normal didn't do us justice. Normal meant injustices against our people. It meant underinvestment of our communities. It meant the exploitation of our lands without our consent. We now have an opportunity to work together to make things better, to develop our solutions collectively, to develop our own laws, to develop whatever it is we need to ensure our people can benefit and thrive. The only way, though, that this is going to happen is if our treaty partners come to the table and will work together effectively and efficiently in true partnership. That includes both the provincial and the federal governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Can I just ask a follow-up question? Could you tell us of some of the specific federal financial supports that have been made available to First Nations communities and how that's been helpful?
Well, the amount, the very initial amount that the federal government announced was $305 million for Indigenous people across Canada. And there was an outcry from our leaders that isn't sufficient. We have 634 First Nations across the country, and that piece of the pie was split three ways with Métis and Inuit. And so in Alberta, we ended up with 26 million. And you know, that amount was insufficient. And but there were other pots that did come later. And so that's an issue that I continue to advocate. The biggest concern was that the funding for the businesses that suffered a lot of losses that our First Nations rely on for their own source revenue, like casinos, oil and gas industries, and so on. Those are not adequately funded for you know, compared to the losses that the First Nations suffered.
Thank you for your remarks. I know that we will have a fulsome conversation when the Q&A section starts, and I'm going to move on to our next panel member, to Dr. Lindsay Croshoe, who is an associate professor in the Cummings School of Medicine's Department of Family Medicine at UCalgary. He's a Piikani First Nation family physician scholar with extensive experience leading large provincial, national, and international research teams focusing on chronic disease and social equity in primary healthcare, public health, and education. Within his research, teaching, and clinical activities, he bridges multiple disciplines, including health, clinical, social sciences, and Indigenous ways of knowing, ensuring they are centered within traditional ethical principles and protocols. Welcome, Dr. Croshu, and thank you for joining us. I know you've been very busy during this crisis. So my question to you is, national public health directives have been a guiding force for provincial and municipal jurisdictions during the pandemic. I'm wondering, how do First Nations communities differ, and how have primary care physicians working on reserves responded?
Thank you for the question, and thank you for inviting me today. I would like to acknowledge the other speakers and Reg and all community members, all people that have taken the time out of their day to come together to share, to have a dialogue. So I really look forward to it. I look forward to hearing Mr. Rob speak. I really appreciated what you said, Marlene. I'd like to sort of respond to some of those things and add it to what I have to say. I've been thinking a lot, as we all have been, about COVID and what it means to us individually. Does it mean to us in terms of our family? What does it mean to us at a organizational level? You know, my role as a physician, what does it mean as a researcher? We've had to make sense of these public health directives in a very iterative manner, because knowledge keeps coming our way frequently, and it moves us. It actually engages us, and has engaged us in deep ways, and forced us to think deeply about what this might mean and reflect on things. And I know that it has created a big burden for all of us, and it's created a big burden for people in general. And I see that the burden shows itself in the patients that I see as a lot of stress, right? A lot of disconnect in the context of us as people being disconnected already, but this like disconnects us even further. But in that, I think I see opportunity, just as Marlene has brought up. There is opportunity for shifting, because we don't shift unless we have discomfort, right? We shift because of dissonance, but it only happens if we engage deeply with that dissonance and that knowledge that's connected to it, and we reach out to each other. And I think that's been happening. So that's my story here. The public health directives are very international, right? They come internationally, and we learn from each other, and we're engaging. I see these public health officials thinking through this stuff and making sense of it. And so these international directives, countries are saying, okay, I think we got to jump on this. We have to do this. So I fully give credit to the amount of work that humans have been doing to make sense of this. And I think that the idea of us flattening the curve has been tremendously successful because of all of the work we've collectively done. So we have to pat ourselves on the back. I think in the way that each of our institutions, whether it's health or education or whatever, we are tasked to make sense of these directives, and we have addressed them, right? And we see our world very different right now. Our world in primary care is very different. I see the same in our communities, that we are very mobile. I think that we have to give another pat on our backs. We are mobile. We respond. We take care of each other. We understand this at a policy and a jurisdictional and a sovereignty issue that the average Canadian doesn't even think about, but we do. And so I think there's some lessons learned from our end that we could share with the rest of Canada and the world. So some of the ways in which we differ, I think there's that issue of sovereignty, of jurisdiction, and what this means in terms of engaging with us respectfully so that we are empowered and we have the autonomy to make decisions. I think a host of those structural factors that are part of the issues of why our health outcomes aren't so good still are a part of this. So inequity, as it translates into less resourcing and less opportunity for shifting and decision making, we always have to sort through this. So I think we will make some sense of that, and this is another great opportunity for us to advocate for shifts and changes. I think that that the mainstay constructs are that in which we differ. But I think that we're communities. I think we're very similar with the rest of the world in that we make it happen by engaging with each other, right? And maybe the difference is we are very mobile. So that was kind of what I started with. I think I think the second part of your question was, how have primary care physicians working on reserve responded? So I can answer that quite easily. I think we do need more knowledge, right? I think the response that we're having right now, we need somebody to make sense of, because across Canada, across Alberta, local communities that engage with each other are making sense and finding innovations and doing some amazing things, right?
Yep.
When I tap into the Indigenous ARP, a group of physicians that are paid in a different way to provide comprehensive care to Indigenous physicians communities across Alberta, that in itself is an innovation, because right now primary care, physician care that is based on fee-for-service has always been challenged to be effective in providing access to our community members. So a different way of paying physicians on a salary has been shown to be an immense opportunity. And so these physicians who are deeply engaged in ensuring high quality care and good access is happening, they've been talking regularly. In my own clinic at the downtown Calgary, the Elbow River Healing Lodge, which I'll include as the bigger picture of Indigenous health, which urban Indigenous populations represent a big component of Indigenous populations in Alberta and across Canada. We've been having regular meetings. We've been talking weekly in the evenings. We've been talking and shifting so frequently based on what these policies have been telling us. So if a directive is saying something, the Alberta healthcare system says something, the public health system says something, and the Calgary health area says something, our primary care network says something, and all of those things, we have to shift and be mobile. So we've been coming together so interestingly and creating innovation. I hear examples of very similar stuff where it's even a higher caliber of outcomes in communities like Siksika that tightly interweave population health and primary health care, because we do know that they're very different systems, but this context has brought these very different systems together, and I find that very interesting. If you look at Ontario, family physicians and communities have come together to create a whole new council of primary care centers that then have a political voice at the table with Ontario Ministry. So this thing has created some big opportunities that I think that we need to ensure that we facilitate further, like comprehensive care via virtual care. All of the policies are in place,
Right.
and now they're stable, and we could enhance our care and our access and our quality going forward in tremendous ways. That this has pushed us a decade ahead in terms of good quality care approaches that will take care of our Indigenous populations and help us to share that care in places, because often it's hard to get individuals up to someplace in the north or even someplace in the inner city, but we can do care in a whole different way now. And I think those are good news stories for us.
That's what I wanted to follow up with, because I wanted to know how you'd adapted delivery of care, given that we've gone to this virtual platform. And is it a flash in the pan, or is it something that has staying power and could have a long-standing impact, a long-lasting impact on healthcare delivery in all First Nations communities across the country? Because it is so powerful to be able to do this virtually, as long as you have the broadband connection.
I think there's some components to this, right? But the components are in place. We need to be able to have the policy at the provincial health level as well as at the college level of physicians. So those two things are in place. So they created these billing codes that said, yeah, go for it. Let's do this. It is the best way to provide care and keep people safe.
Sure.
At one point in time, they canceled them. They said, "Oh, the epidemic level has gone down, so let's cancel those codes now." And then 2 days later, there was an announcement that said, "No, these codes are actually now permanent." So that means the funding and the policy context are stable, right?
Right.
There's an issue of payment and the relationship between physicians in Alberta and the government, which we still have to address, right?
Yes.
But the policy contexts are there. The technology context is there. The willingness by physicians and clinics and communities to engage in this is there. We have some technological limitations, which is another equity issue in the far north.
Right.
If we can work through that bandwidth, meaning internet access, so that people can have this. Telephone has been the mainstay right now. Like my access, my utilization rates. I would often get lots of no-shows once in a while, depending on the time of the month, because people, first of all, have to go across the city, park, come to the clinic, wait in line, and all those things are barriers to access. Without that, it's like my patients, I call them up and they're like, "Whoa, thanks, this is great," right? Like people are so happy about this. I can take care of a good majority of things in the moment. There are many things that I actually have to see people, but I now have flexibility because we've been developing safe care in person using PPE and all that good stuff. So we have
Sure.
protocols in place. So I can see people on the days that I want to schedule people for, when I need to do physical exams and all that kind of stuff. But a big majority of people I can just connect to virtually and connect to. Like continuity is a big component of family medicine, right?
Sure.
The ability
Yep.
to like see
Continuity
people
of care.
many times
Yep.
over a period of time. It's not just one consultation where I try to spend 45 minutes and then see you later. It's like I spend half an hour or more, and I have the ability to do that consecutively over years. And that's what family medicine is about. I think virtual care will even perpetuate that in great ways. So I see good things. That all the constituent components are in place. I
Yep.
have a research network that is poised to evaluate this, measure it, advocate for it, and build it across Alberta and across the country. So there are good things that we can cash in on this. Knowing that we've been through a lot. There are things and a group of people in place that are wanting to make good things come about and perpetuate that.
Thanks, Lindsay. Thanks so much. I'm going to move on to our third panelist today, and that's Ryan Robb. He's the Chief Executive Officer for the Stoney Tribal Administration, representing the 3 Stoney Nakoda Nations, Bearspaw, Chiniki, and Wesley First Nations. Ryan was previously a member of Suncor's Stakeholder and Aboriginal Relations Group, where he worked with the business units and functions to assist them in meeting their social goals with respect to Aboriginal peoples in energy development. He was also the lead corporate support for Suncor's Aboriginal Employees Network. Ryan has also served as the Chief Executive Officer for the Treaty 7 Management Corporation, which represented the 7 nations that comprise Treaty 7. Welcome, Ryan.
Thank you very much, Chancellor Yedlin, and I'd like to first thank, and I'm happy to say 2 Dr. Crowshoes on our panel today, but
That's right.
I'll go with Elder Reg. I'd like to thank him for his prayers and his comments this morning, and also to recognize Chief Marlene and the other Dr. Crowshoe, Lindsay, for your words today. I think it's great, and thank you to UFC and to you, Chancellor, for moderating today and hearing our stories. So I'm happy to be here.
Well, thanks for joining us. So my question for you is that we've had 19 cases confirmed. The Stoney Nation has been the hardest hit with COVID-19 in the Treaty 7 region. How did the community respond, and how, as the CEO for the Stoney Tribal Administration, were you able to balance Western and Indigenous approaches in response to the pandemic?
Sure. So I'll probably quickly clarify. I know when we wrote this, we would have been the hardest hit with 19. Since then, unfortunately, our friends in the blood tribe have surpassed that number. So our thoughts, as Chief Marlene said, are definitely with them. Hopefully I'll reverse your question and you're okay with me answering it that way. I take a lot of interest actually in the concept of balancing Western and Indigenous approaches, or contemporary versus traditional approaches. Some of this is lots of teachings I would have from Reg and people like him, other elders that I would have had. I think another way to perhaps term this is maybe more as best practices. What can we learn from best practices? I don't think these concepts always have to be separate. I think quite often that they can be complementary to each other instead of different. So when I say something like best practices, I think we need to contextualize that a bit. Indigenous people have always learned from others, have always been benefiting, and that may have been things like ceremonies and teachings. It may have been come together songs and headdress transfers, informations like that. Concepts like lifelong learning have always been part of Indigenous culture. Learning from others has always been part of First Nations culture. And so to a little bit of context on that, fast forward to today a little bit, the Stonies, unfortunately, as many other nations, this is not our first go around with disasters, natural disasters of first pandemic in a fair amount of years. But we were hit quite hard by the 2013 floods and lost a very high percentage, several hundred houses were either damaged or written off. And so what happened was our chiefs and our elected leadership were cognizant of this, and in going out to restaff and hire, they made the conscious effort that they wanted to find out how are we going to move forth? How are we going to look at doing things perhaps differently than we have in the past? So some of the, and I've been at Stony for now just a year, some of the more recent hires, including myself, have come from industry that have, specific to this issue, have experience either with disasters or protocols that we would use to sort of address it. So one of the first things that we identified, I am very lucky that my Director of Emergency Management, or DEM as they're called, is an exceptionally experienced fellow by the name of Mike Crawford, who spent 30 years as a firefighter and a district fire chief actually in Calgary for many of those years. So in discussions between he and I and our health departments, we recognized that First Nations were very, very underserved in having what we call ERPs, or emergency response plans. There's not great funding sources through traditional, which may have been governments to look at. We did have some support from the AEMA that has been invaluable, but we actually looked and tapped on industry. We actually secured money from TransCanada, because we're a consultation nation on Coastal GasLink. And we use that to do emergency response planning for ourselves. And then that allows us to take a snapshot or an environmental scan of where we're at and what risks are we going to have. Now, I'd love to tell you that COVID and the pandemic was on our risks. And while it was identified as a potential risk, it certainly wasn't in our very top of how to respond. For us, we have 3 physical land masses, 3 physical reserves, and they would have slightly different risks that could go. And so the most northern one is Bighorn, where it may be dam breach and a flood and or wildfires. Those would be the big ones. The one that most people would be familiar with is halfway between Calgary and Banff, and that's Morley. Well, we have rail lines going through. So we'd have floods, obviously, that we've seen, rail cars, and fire again. And then Eden Valley, which is further south, sort of closer to Longview, if you will. And of course, we can have wildfire issues down there. But one of the things we identified through our ERP was what kind of process or governance system can we set up that'll help us to identify, prepare, respond, and adapt to any issues that may come up. So in this case, we'll use the pandemic. So we employed a system called ICS, or Incident Command System. This is quite standard in industry. Most big oils, I know in Suncor, I did ICS training within the first 30 days of being there. There's very few First Nations that have utilized this system. And what is it really? A governance system, emergency management governance system. It's used quite frequently, like I said, by industry. Would have been used in the Fort McMurray fires. It was in Slave Lake. And when we hear of Canadian firefighters going to Australia to battle fires, it's usually less on the ground boots and really more in the ICS system and in the management of how we're going to deploy our resources correctly. So we had in January dictated out through all of our organizations. We have about 650 employees. We had actually just designated that we wanted to have every employee to have at least ICS level 100 training, as well as we were going through with our leadership, so all of our elected officials ICS training. Unfortunately, because the pandemic hit, we managed to get about 150 through out of our staff and about half of our leadership, but it put us in a really good position to be able to respond to the pandemic. So fast forward to what really happened, we did end up with, as I mentioned, we weren't the first nation to have a COVID positive case, but I think we were actually the second, but we did end up having an outbreak that did go up to 19. It was picked up actually in contact tracing from Cargill. So without having the benefit of a virus carrying blockchain, so we can see exactly where it came from, it most likely came from Cargill. And so we were affected in very much the same way. And we were very concerned because we have very many of the same determinants and demographic as employees at Cargill would have had. We'd have multiple generations in a house. It's certainly not uncommon to have 10 people living in a house. The other issue that had come out is a transmission portal is many people in a vehicle. In Cargill's case, it was commuting from High River or Calgary or Okotoks or what have you. In our case, Eden Valley, you spend a long time with people in it. So that's ICS. Once we had an outbreak there, we were extremely concerned. And so we had to put in all of the protocols that we had developed, all the response plans that we had developed. And one of the most important of which was communications. We did do a dive after the 2013 floods, and communications became one of the biggest identified issues that we had to address. So we set up almost immediately a clean website called StoneyNakotanation.com, and then through the Facebook pages to constantly put out the information that was required. And while the Moccasin Telegraph can be quite effective, Facebook and the internet can even be more effective.
Right.
And part of what we did was we also wanted to identify what did our membership look like and what was their abilities. And one of the things that's not unique to Stoney, but is really important to understand for Stoney is the Stoney language is extreme. There's an extremely high retention rate in the mid 90s. And for the vast majority, Stoney is a first language. So what we did was we identified that. And so the website that we used, we actually started to create videos in both languages, in both English and in Stoney. And it's actually quite a plain and boring looking website without being very much of a technophile. It looks kind of boring to me, but the concept is we don't necessarily have great connectivity either. So you could go in near a school or near wherever, and you could read the title or the headline of what the video was. They could download it onto their iPhone or what have you. And then when they went to visit their grandparents, they would be able to play the videos from the chiefs, from the counselors, from our staff in Stoney. So we had used language that way as a great tool for ourselves. The nice thing about the ICS, as I mentioned, was it allowed us to plan and know more or less what we were going to need. We then, of course, fell, like everybody else, to the issue. I think it was a bit of a double-edged sword knowledge. We actually knew where we'd be short on items, and we weren't necessarily scrambling to find out what our requirements were, but we were then scrambling to fulfill what our requirements were.
Sure.
One of the things that we did do, and we're quite proud of, we had a lot of support from Chief Marlene as well, was the Stonies. We knew right away, and we were hearing that one of the biggest issues we were going to have, and again, recognizing what our demographics looked like with an amount of people in houses, was we would have the requirement for isolation centers, or as we called them, support centers, almost immediately. So most big cities, lots of hospitals, they've got the same type of concepts. They were scrambling to set these up as well. Yep. These would have been for positive patients. So we're quite proud of ourselves, and had a fair amount of comments from Dr. Hinshaw and others that we were the first one in Alberta, and probably Canada, have an on-reserve isolation center set up to service our people, should they require it. So I'm happy to say now, out of those 19 we have had, they were all recovered. We have had 0 in the last 5 to 6 weeks. We had declared our state of local emergency, or SOL, as they're called, on the 17th of March, about the same time as everybody else did. And I'm happy to say, I just saw the emails go through. We've actually rescinded our SOL as of today. So that doesn't mean that the guard's down. That doesn't mean that the vigilance is there. That doesn't mean that we pack everything up. But our emergency command center that we were running to address all of this, we've scaled back, just like most municipalities are. And should the requirement come for us to reactivate, we have those processes there. So then the last point maybe I'll have is we have actually engaged with the AMA. Actually, one of the most important things I think we can have out of this, and this is again learnings, and on purpose I'm blurring between traditional and contemporary. Downtown we would call a after action report, or a 360 review, or whatever. What we really want to do is we're going to have a third party come in and help us through the steps that we took to get to where we were. What were successes, what were not successes, where are new opportunities, and that'll help us build a more fulsome report back, and a more fulsome plan going forward for hopefully not the next pandemic, but the next emergency response that we'll have to activate.
Yeah, as they say, if you can measure it, you can manage it. You have to know what you're measuring, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you for your comments. So I have a question that's come in. It's for Lindsay, and it is about what your #1 wish as a doctor providing care to Indigenous remote people. What is your #1 wish, Lindsay? And then perhaps we can go to Chief Marlene and to Ryan.
Hey, thanks for the question. My #1 wish, I think it would be wellness, right? That people have the capacity to be well within, because of the resources they have at hand, right? Because of the social connections that I know are, thinking about what is fundamental to wellness, thinking about like the baseline stuff, good food, good housing, safe place to stay, and as we go up, kind of like the levels that are tiers of that helps us to be well. I think it's the nature of our social connections and the ability to connect with each other in ways that are strong and good and wholesome, and the ways that we can do to facilitate connecting with the environment and the creator. So having the capacity to go to be self-actualized and through connection, because I think that's important for us as Indigenous people, is all our relations, to have the ability to achieve that. That's my wish.
Chief Marlene.
Thank you. I guess my biggest wish is for all First Nations, regardless of where they live, to have access to good quality health care. You have some of the northern remote communities who have who have to fly into larger centers to access doctors and the health services that they need. So there's a real inequality in terms of the services that are provided to First Nations. And so, to me, it's key. And the other, I guess, big factor that's related to health determinants is the housing and the foundation. Build the foundation of the community so that our people can live in a healthy and prosperous way. Thank you.
Thanks. Ryan, would you like to answer that question?
Thanks,
as well?
Chancellor. My wish is that for Indigenous people to recognize and understand that the same positive outcomes and possible outcomes are available to Indigenous people as they are to non-Indigenous people. And that it's incumbent upon us as leaders to make sure that we're offering and educating our people of how to get to those outcomes. And again, it might be we looked around, in our case, we looked around and we took the best out of government, the best out of industry, the best out of other First Nations, and compiled them together to control the outcomes of our own outcomes, our own determination of what we're doing. But to not feel that you're pigeonholed in and there's only one route out. There's always different ways to do it. And that is actual traditional teachings. It is to learn and be adaptable.
Right, and it's really about eliminating barriers, because what
You
we're
betcha.
talking about in
Yep.
across the spectrum is everybody's talking about eliminating barriers. So another question, we'll start with Lindsay. Are you finding there are enough Indigenous people trained to work and working in the healthcare system? If not, what do we need to change this?
Right.
What and how, I guess? Two things.
So I don't think there's enough.
Okay.
I think we need to.
What's your
start-
number? Like when you say that's not enough, is it like, you know, by what magnitude would you like to increase it?
By at least 10 to 100 times more. I would say that we've been striving to achieve this for decades now. We recognize the gap. We recognize that the system likes to perpetuate itself in terms of the type of people that they choose and train and then become physicians. I think that over the last decade, we've been seeing ways to address that because our schools have been saying, okay, there are structural issues that cause these issues. So therefore we need to look beyond our own noses, right? And instead of just seeing what we want to see as ourselves in these as these doctors, but look towards the struggles and the complexities of life that people live within and see how they have survived and thrived, like this concept, right, of resilience, and use that as a lens and use those barriers as a lens to see it as strengths. And so we're shifting those things. At our school, we started to use that equity-based approach, and we in the old days before I came here, we used to only offer a seat or so to an Indigenous trainee a year every few years, but we created a new policy. We envisioned equity. We saw how social context and social inequities create poor educational outcomes and barriers, and saw that we are facilitating that and perpetuating that. And we shifted the admissions processes, and now we offer 10 to 20 seats every year to Indigenous applicants, and we're getting 5 to 10 applicants saying, yes, I'd love to go to Calgary, knowing that many of these applicants get offers from across Canada. So I think the ways that we have to do it is to be really critical of the systems, and that the systems have to understand how they perpetuate inequity, and they have to be strong in doing that. And you need like a whole vertical and horizontal levels of leadership that connect to this. I also think that, you know, most of healthcare system is going to still be non-Indigenous, and most Indigenous people will still interface with non-Indigenous people through the majority of their healthcare activities.
Right.
And so our approaches have to take those notions of structural competency, racism, culture as a facilitative sort of component to it, and know that together they form a unique knowledge set and skill set that describes Indigenous healthcare, and that we have to train effectively. So that's been part of the strategies that we have across Canada. We all always have troubles achieving that intention because of not enough of us to do the teaching. So our strategies have to include, say, people like people who want to facilitate others and doing the teaching. So that's been my intention, is to have structure, facilitate others to do it, and whether it's more Indigenous people in the workforce, help our institution to see the light and shift, help other institutions to see that same light and shift, helping our institutions to train all people to create this this workforce that's a mixture of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people that provide unique and high quality care that integrates the concepts of Indigenous health, that it's very distinct. That's what I'm I lost track of your question, but that's what I hope for.
It's fine. I mean, I think you answered the question, and I've got another one sort of as a follow-up, but I'll start with Marlene, I guess, and we could sort of go across the panel again. But you know, there's been physical health that's been affected by COVID-19, but we are talking mental health as well. And so I'm curious as to what strategies were used to deal with the mental health issues in your communities, and what role did spirituality and religion play in supporting the community to come through this these very, very challenging times. So I'll start with Chief Poitras, if you could lead us off with that.
Well, I know mental health is a huge concern. I mean, you had, you know, higher rates of suicide. You had domestic abuse that was occurring, and it just goes on and on. And that was something that we addressed numerous times through different forums, I guess. And, you know, one of the recommendations that I had was to utilize our elders, and, you know, in different forums. But then, of course, the biggest issue was the broadband and, you know, internet and lack of services. So that was a huge concern, and especially for many of our First Nations people who live off reserve. You know, they had tremendous issues accessing services, and it just seemed like, you know, they weren't looked after to the extent that they should have been. And so yeah, there's just a whole range of issues around that, and, you know, trying to address it. Of course, you know, you want to talk about ceremonies, you want to talk about utilizing our elders, but then you have to have safe physical and social distancing. And so that became an issue in terms of the ceremonies, and how do we move forward with that. And so it was just, it continues to be an issue, and that's something that we continue to work on. And even in terms of the leadership, you know, talking COVID 24/7, and that was my case, and I had nobody to, you know, talk to, and so that was something that I had to be cognizant within myself, and do things like go outside, go for a walk, go put tobacco, go hug a tree, or, you know, just do different things. But not a lot of people have access to that, like especially the marginalized, vulnerable populations within the cities. And our elders, you know, our elders were, you know, on lockdown, and like my mother, she's 85. She's like, okay, I'm going out. Enough is enough. You know, because we're very social people, right?
Right.
And so just finding ways and trying to encourage people to, you know, maintain the safety of one another is really key. So thank you.
Thank you for your answer. Unfortunately, we've got about 2 minutes before we're supposed to wrap up. So I'd like to ask Reg to come back and to share some grounding remarks and to close our discussion in a good way. Reg? There he is.
Okay. I just want to thank all the panelists this afternoon for their thoughts, their ideas, and their discussions. There was a lot to talk about, and I learned from every one of them some more information on how to move ahead with this pandemic. I just look at, there's we here, when Indigenous people are dealing with pandemics, we still need to understand that we live in today's society, and that includes working with jurisdictions, and including the treaties and the elders and their ceremonial ways, and how we can work together. I like Regional Chief's idea of now is the time, all of a sudden we're finding time to start working together. I think we need to come together with those communities to be able to find that time. And as communities, it's COVID that we're getting hit with, and there's going to be other things that are in the horizon that are coming at us that we need to deal with, that include things like systematic problems that we might have to answer. So I look at Dr. Lindsay talking about we need to work with this burden of the COVID and understand the disconnect, the stress that hits us, especially urbanized Indigenous communities that are disconnected from their cultural ways. We need to start looking at how can we connect them with that traditional knowledge, and the elders that move into a city to start working with elders that are from their home communities. So I agree, we got to give ourselves a pat on the back for what we've done and how we look at being able to work together and move ahead from here today. And I know Stony was in our region, in the southern part here, was the first ones being hit with the COVID, and I think Stony is through their language and their culture are one of the main communities that speak their language, and being able to understand Indigenous languages across the province and how they relate to understanding this burden and understanding jurisdiction, understanding health, those communicating with Western languages, those are challenges that we need to understand. I was talking to an elder a while ago, and he said, we were with a group, and he got up and he said, today we're in this pandemic because Mother Earth is mad at us for not respecting her. And that was his statement. After the statement, I met with the elder and I asked him to define what he just said in Blackfoot, in our language. And what I understand him saying, he said, in our worldview, all creation is natural law. And creation is even micro matter, which was all normal before because we all coexisted. He said environment is life and life is environment, but we all coexisted, and that was normal. He said, but today, modern people are commodifying those matters, and as they commodify, they put everything off balance. He said the COVID was here before us, and it was always been here. We need to learn to be able to live with it and be able to work with it, because it has just as much right to live as we do. So he said, Mother Earth is just wanting to get back to normal. And COVID is one way of how Mother Earth is looking at getting back to normal. So those are Indigenous knowledges that we need to tap into, those resources to help us working with Western written system worldviews. And that is so important. We have an oral system and there is a written system, but both systems need to be able to work together and take on challenges like COVID, like racism, like health issues. I think those are important as we move ahead. So with that, I just like to thank you for the opportunity to sum up, and it was great to see all of you. It puts a smile on my face, and all the viewers, I'm happy that they tuned in. I wish we had more time, but there'll be another opportunity. Thank you.
Definitely. Thank you so much, Reg, and thank you for your insights and for being with us today. And thank you also to Regional Chief Poitras, to Dr. Lindsay Croshoe, and to Ryan Robb for joining us. I'm so proud that UCalgary has been able to share your voices. As an institution, we have a long path to walk towards genuine reconciliation. Each and every one of us plays a part in this ongoing transformation. I want to thank everyone who joined us today for sharing space and being part of the conversation. And I encourage you to take your learnings with you and pass them on. You'll receive an email with a link to review this session on demand if you'd like to share it with somebody else. And please continue to engage with UCalgary and its Indigenous strategy, Itapatope, by visiting ucalgary.ca/Indigenous. The University of Calgary offers a variety of Indigenous-focused academic programs, professional workshops, resources, and events to help educate our campus community, address reconciliation, and spark transformation across the institution and in our broader community. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you next time.